My earliest memories is a double-decker tram rattling down Seabird Road in Johannesburg. And then I recall the shop, the grocery shop. My mother was mostly there. My father was away, I believe, running a dairy. This was somewhere around 1938, I think. Uh, my parents had come from Lithuania, from a shtetl called Linkova in the 1920s, and had got married in South Africa. We had a very nice, plump, colored lady who was always around. I presume she was our servant, and she lived across the road at the back of a house. I remember going to visit her when she was ill. We lived just below the road that was under a train that ran constantly, and there was these what they called booms, and every time a train came past, these booms came down and you couldn't cross. I remember once my older brother Morris, was left on the other side of the booms when the trains crossed, and there was a lot of how do you do? Everybody was running around screaming and shouting and crying, but eventually they found him somewhere on the other side. I recall that after a while my mother and father acquired a lady to run a store across the road, a kind of a cafe. The woman's name was Mrs. Kremer. I believe she looked after the shop. So my father was involved in a few kind of enterprises. None of them seemed to be very successful. I remember how scared we were in the shop because there were a lot of black people around. We were, who were mostly our customers in the shop, and occasionally they got a bit nasty. And I recall once my father even getting involved in a kind of a fracas with one of these people in the shop. We used to go for little walks. I always recall they were building a new rugby stadium nearby called Ellis Park, and we used to go and play there sometimes. The next things I recall was there was a Jewish day school, Hebrew school. I used to ride on the back of a kind of a car. Or actually, it wasn't really a car. It was really a sort of a bicycle with an attachment to it. And they used to put us into this back attachment, myself and a little boy called Basil Fine. And then we used to go to this Hebrew school. I think it was a Jewish nursery. We were there most of the morning, and then they brought us back. I think this black gentleman, was working for the Fine family, and he would bring us back in this little attachment to a bicycle, like a tricycle actually. My other early recollections was that my uncle Isaac used to come along most Sundays to visit, and on odd occasions he would take us, myself and Morris. I'm not sure if Sam was born yet. Sam was born in 1939, and he used to take us to the Germiston Lake. It was like a big outing for us to go, and we'd have a little picnic at the lake. Germiston Lake was about something like 10-15 miles from Johannesburg. And my uncle at that stage was unmarried. The other recollections I have in those early days, pre-1940, was that the first movies were coming into the country, and on the side of the railway line there were these big billboards, and I remember seeing some of these big signs outside advertising. I remember Gaslight and Fanny by Gaslight, which showed for that time, a long time, somewhere, I don't know where the movie houses were at that stage. As we grew a little older, we began to kind of get away from our local area. there were some little friends that we had. There were I can't recall the name. There was a boy called Ivan and his sister Norma. Unfortunately, Ivan died a very tragic death when he must have been about 16, when he was killed by a truck that jumped across the road and slammed him into a tree. And he was my earliest friend. And then there was also the Kowalskis and their little boy that we used to play with. They were neighbors who stayed in a building, like a 3-flat, 2-story building next to where we stayed. We lived in a little house at the back of the shop, which was connected. And in those days, there was no baths indoors, and so we had a kind of a copper or some kind of metal bath, and the water had to be boiled on the stove, and then we had a bath in the water once the boiling water was placed inside. At that stage in my life, I remember that we were able to communicate in Yiddish because my parents didn't really speak much English. And then around about that time, there was a lot of goings on. I recall that there was another little child born named Norman, who was constantly ill, and there were frequent visits by doctors to our house. One was a lady doctor, I think her name was Mary Gordon, and there was a Dr. Teddy Schneider, and this child was constantly being taken to hospital and brought back, and then died at about 3 months of age. I can't remember the exact year this was, but it was somewhere after the birth of Sam. In the early 1940s, business was particularly bad, I gather, where we lived. And at that stage, my parents moved to a shop called Parkside Tirum, which was opposite the main shul, Walman Street Synagogue, which was on Walman Street near the Jabert Park. And so we moved into a house nearby. That was the first time we actually had a little garden or piece of land in the house. And most of our time was spent, when we came home, we spent it in the shop. Or my mother was upstairs making dinner for us, or downstairs, I can't remember. I think the house was all on one level. At the time of this happening, I actually have some recollection of starting school, which was the Jewish government school, which was a few blocks away. I think the street was called N Street, and it was right by the Dornfontein railway station. The trip took about 10 minutes but we walked. We didn't needed any transport, and my elder brother was with me. And then we went to Cheder, right across the road from where our shop was, because there was a Hebrew school there called the Hebrew High School, which was connected with the Walman Street Synagogue. We went to all the Jewish high holidays, however, at another shul, which was called Berel Chagi, after a famous cantor called Berel Chagi. It was actually the Central Orthodox Synagogue on Sherwell Street. There were a number of moves that we made from different homes in the same street, because the house we were staying in got demolished, and then we moved to Sherwell Street, Dornfontein, a few blocks down, while the new building was built. And we moved into that building in about 1947. It was called St. Anthony's. It was one of the new buildings that was put up in this area, where there were now multiple buildings, and this area of Johannesburg was called Hillbrow. During this period, we seemed to spend a lot of time going to the wondrous cricket ground, which was again a fairly short walk, about 10-15 minutes from where we lived. And whenever there was some kind of sporting event, we tried to go there. I remember you could get a soccer season ticket for 1 shilling, which enabled you to go to all the soccer matches every Saturday for the whole season, which we seemed to go quite a lot to watch. And then on the Sundays, we would often play soccer between the local kids, either on a patch of ground opposite our store or in the particular Wanderers club I mentioned, which was the headquarters for the rugby and cricket. Most of the rugby was played on a ground at the back. And then I recall going to Jewish government school. We were actually quite a well-known soccer and cricket team. We always did very well, and I was on the cricket team. Although I didn't play in every game, I was like an extra, I suppose. The soccer team was always winning the local Transvaal Challenge Cup, and in fact I played the goalkeeper for this soccer team, which eventually won the Transvaal Cup, and we played the last game ever at the Wanderers when we won the Transvaal section into regional, where we beat a team from, I think it was either Boksburg or Benoni, in the final 5-0. And so there was the glory years. And then at that stage I left Parktown High to go to high school. If I remember very clearly that most of the kids who went to Dorfentine School went to Athlone High School, and myself and one other kid, we, for some reason or other, we did not want to go to Athlone High School, and we were able to go to Parktown High, which was really out of our region and which required taking buses to get to school and also walking some distance. My parents, of course, never could leave and come with me to school because they were always tied up in the shop. And I spent a lot of my time in the afternoon and evenings after school helping in the shop, helping if there was customers, if I could serve them, or if I could just call my parents to their attention that there were people in the shop. When this happened, by this stage, Harold had been born, my youngest brother. That was 1944. And so we used to also sometimes take Harold for a walk in the park. And at the time we lived in St. Anthony, it was a bit squashed and cramped. And then subsequently we had to leave the shop because they decided to break down that building and then rebuild and build another store. And at that time we had moved to Berea, into a house in Berea, and we also had moved to another building on the corner of that street. So there were a number of moves in that same block while they rebuilt one part and then rebuilt another. And so we actually lived in 4 different places in that same block over a period probably of maybe 5 to 6 years, until eventually my father, with some assistance from Uncle Isaac, was able to put down some money for a house in Berea on High Street. The significance of High Street was that the tram ran right in front, and so it was easy for us to take the tram to the shop and to go to school and so on. That will come a bit later. Then, of course, there was always the little soccer game that went on at Cheder before Cheder. We used to have to tear ourselves away from the game, and it was like a big fight with the Cheder teacher before we came into class. going back to Jewish government school, some of my remembrances are that I had quite a few confrontations, if I could say it, with the school teachers, and I spent a fair number of days sitting outside in the grounds on a bench. I was supposed to go and tell my parents to come because I had been misbehaving. However, I never really did go there. I always came back and told them that my parents were unable to come, they were too busy, or some other excuse. And somehow nothing ever happened about it. But I suppose I did okay because I seemed to be top of the class mostly, so it didn't seem to affect my learning or my intelligence. So that's one of the things I recall particularly about Jewish government school. We played a lot of soccer because there were no practices in the afternoon, so in the lunch periods we always practiced. And the other thing I always remember was I brought sandwiches to school, and so did some of my friends. Two of the friends I always remember was Yank Silver and Schmeck Bloch, who we often traded sandwiches. They liked my fat bread sandwiches, I liked their thin ones. And so we always used to trade sandwiches. And there was also another boy called Jaime Orlin, who didn't actually live in Dornfontein. He lived in Hillbrow, near a hotel called the Commodore Hotel, which was, I believe, the property of his parents. Jaime Orlin and Schmeck Bloch went to Parktown High, and so I didn't see them for a long time. But then I went to Parktown High with the only other boy from my class was a boy called Oscar Taub, who I suppose you would qualify as a nerd these days. But at least there was somebody I knew. The funniest thing I could recall is going to Parktown High, which was in 1947, was not knowing where the school actually was. I was walking around kind of not knowing exactly where to go when I met a guy whose name was Michaelo, I think, and he actually showed me where Parktown High School was. And so that was the next era of my life, was Parktown High School, which I went to from 1947 till 1951, and most of my remembrances of Parktown High was the fact that because of my need to help in the shop in the afternoons, I wasn't often able to go to school and play after school and joining with all the activities. So mostly I only participated in the sport in the local, what we called houses. The school was divided into 5 different houses, and they played one another without, going to practices or anything like that. So I didn't actually play organized sport until really when I was in Form 4, which was the second last year of my schooling there. During this period, I remember Harold was starting to go to school or kindergarten, and Morris was already at Parktown. He went to Athlone High School, and he was having a lot of problems with the teachers. There was always a lot of fighting and arguing going on with my parents and him. I don't really know what it was all about, but I gather he was not performing as well as he should, and he left school before completing high school. I remember he went to work with a company called M. Bloch and Company, which was a company that traded and sold, clothing, jackets, and all that sort of stuff. They were the intermediaries for smaller retail outlets. I remember that my mother in 1948 was very ill, and at that stage she had to go and have emergency surgery. Subsequently, we found out that she'd had cancer of the uterus, but apparently, even though the doctor had stated that the prognosis was poor, it seemed like she never had any real problems from it afterwards. But my parents had never actually been away on a vacation for all the time that I recall. And it was at this stage the doctor said it was necessary for them to actually go away on a vacation so that my mother could recuperate after the surgery. And so for the first time, my mother and father in 1948 went for 3 weeks to Cape Town, Muizenberg actually. And in order to be able to do this, my older brother, Morris, who was 16, actually was kept out of school for this period of time in order to run the store. And a woman called Mrs. Horwitz, who was a friend of the family and lived in a building close to our shop, actually came and stayed there in order to be somebody of an adult type to help out in the store, merely for, I suppose, for company and protection. And then when I came back from school, she went back to her apartment. And then I helped my brother in the shop with the selling, not only with the selling, but also with the buying of goods. The people used to come around, they used to call them travelers, who were the salesmen for various companies. And I was already familiar with the stock and with the needs, and I would order all the cigarettes and candies that were necessary to buy over that period, because this was done on a twice-weekly basis. Particularly those days, cigarettes was a big part of the sales. And also, I would make sure the money was deposited in the bank. At this stage of my life, I was actually about 13, so it was quite an occupation for a 13-year-old. The other thing I recall, of course, was my bar mitzvah, which was when I was 13, and that was held at the Beth HaMedrash HaGadol synagogue. And then we had a kind of a party, a reception at Ginsberg's Hall. It seemed like most people had receptions at Ginsberg's Hall. And I don't know what it cost my parents, but I remember how sad they were because a lot of people didn't come. And it kind of was a feeling that it was because our parents were not very well off, and a lot of the people who did have better living conditions or were more affluent tended to shy away. But there were a lot of the old shtetl friends came. It was like, whenever somebody got married or had a bar mitzvah, all the people from that shtetl seemed to be invited. So Linkover was represented at my bar mitzvah. At that time, I can recall that we had to take care of Harold a lot because, my parents were tied up, and so whenever we came home or we were doing nothing, it was always take Harold for a walk. And so we used to push the pram. The maid sometimes did help, of course, but the maid was also taking care of the house and the cooking with my mother, cleaning up. So it was a little difficult. Some years later, it was talking about Harold. When I left high school, I took a job, and at that stage, Harold was still going to Jewish government school. And I would take him in the morning with a bus going into town to work, and then drop him off at the school. And everybody actually thought I was his father. I mean, I was only probably 16, 18, somewhere in that range. I don't know how people could think I was his father, but there we are. But it was strange that I was the one who took him to school, because my parents were unable to do so because they were tied up with a shop. The shop used to open at 7 a.m. and used to close at 10 o'clock at night. And it was like a kind of a drugstore in the American way, we served milkshakes and cold drinks, but we didn't serve any meals or anything. And at one time we even sold, fish, fresh fish and stuff. So it was kind of a mixed bag. And in those days, people didn't self-serve. Everything was behind the counters, and you had to actually take them and give it to the people. So you needed lots of hands. And so there was many hands, myself, my older brother. At sometime during my stay at Parktown High, I started to play cricket with the school team. I remember, and coming from nowhere, I actually made the second cricket team, and I played a little bit of rugby, but not very much really. And most of my sporting days were when I was at university. I remember that I had a few, some kind of ups and downs with the teachers there, but mostly I was a fairly good student, and although I didn't always reach the kind of heights that was predicted for me after I left Jewish government school, a lot of it probably to do with the fact that I had too many things on my plate, and I couldn't quite give every moment of my time to my schooling. But I didn't do too badly at the school, so things were not that bad as far as the scholastic part of it all. After I finished Parktown High School, that was about end of 1951. I went straight into a job in order to earn some money, and I actually worked for a wholesale company called African Fancy Goods, which they sold glassware and to retail stores. And the funniest thing was, after I'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks, some guy who had a barber shop plus fancy good shop invited me to come and work for him at an increased salary because he thought I was such a good salesman. Anyway, I worked at this place for about 2 months. Of course, while I was there, I knew that I'd already passed my matriculation, which was when you finish high school there, and I had done fairly well, and was able to go to university. There was a lot of people who kept on badgering me that I shouldn't waste my life. I should go into the university and get a degree in some profession. I wasn't particularly keen on anything, to be honest, but they talked me into doing medicine. I was poo-pooing all the other professions. Somehow I stayed with medicine, and I was able to get into the medical school, what they called the pre-med program, which in South Africa meant that you went for 1 year into the basic sciences, and at the end of that year, you then qualified to go to the medical school, which was a 6-year course. The final year of the 6 years is actually just the internship. So I remember we had a bunch of people in our first year of medical school who we kind of went around with most of the time. Wherever we went, we sort of went in this group. There was about 7 or 8 of us. I recall mainly Yank Silver, who was the same Silver that had gone to Jewish government school. And I always remember Yank Silver particularly because the Yank came from his mother always calling him Yankala. And they actually came from Leeds, and they spoke with a real northern English accent, although they were Jewish. And so Yank was one of our group. There was a guy called Schneider. There was Giles Sekiari and Bernie Goodman, Norman Miller, and some other guys whose names just escape me at the moment. Young Silver's father, of course, was a taxi driver, and so Young Silver was the one who often had access to a car. Most of us used to either walk or go on bicycle. I used to always walk to medical school. So Young Silver became our kind of taxi driver, and sometimes he would pick up a fare on the way going somewhere, which was quite hilarious. And we had a lot of good times together in that first year at medical school. You mustn't forget, I was only about 16 at the time, and so we were a little immature, although we were not stupid in terms of learning. It was a very tough year because I think the changeover from the high school to the university was fairly difficult for most of us. The only other problem was that medical class was kind of a large number, and the idea was that they would accept in an experiment as many guys as they could into the first year, and then at the end of the year they would then only take those who did very well. So there was no guarantee that after completion of this first year of basic sciences that you would be promoted to the second year of medical school. And so there were a couple of guys like Eugene Toker and Louis Berman who were extremely bright and conscientious, who wouldn't even help you or let you see how the experiment went if you were stuck, because they were afraid that you might do better than them as a result, and they might not get into the next phase of medical school. So there were some of these guys who had this strange way of preventing you from actually being helped by them. However, be it as it may, at the end of this very strenuous year, doing subjects that were anathema to me, certainly, like botany and physics, which I really never did like, and chemistry, which was okay, and zoology, which wasn't bad. There was a large number of failures at the end of that first year. And so some of this group that we had disappeared, because if you failed more than 2 subjects, you didn't get any chance of going back to medical school. So out of this group, there was myself, Young Silver, Bernie Goodman, and Giles Secchiari that continued on into the second year of medical school. And meantime, while this was going on, my parents still were running their store, and so after classes I often used to have to run back and help out between 5 and 7 or 5 and 8, and sometimes at least once a week. My brother Morris and I would take over the store from the 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock until closing, so my parents could go to a movie or so they could have a night off. And on most Sundays we were in the store so my parents could rest in the afternoon. And so a lot of my studying was done behind the counter between customers. And a lot of my customers often wanted to know whether I was at medical school part-time, because I seemed to spend a lot of time in the store. But in that kind of store which had small profits, you could not afford to really keep people to assist, so it became the need for the family to be behind the counter. For the first time while I was in medical school, I got involved with the rugby there, which was organized sport. And for someone who never really played much organized rugby, I started off, of course, way down on the list, because the people who'd come from all the top high schools with all the knowledge of their abilities all were able to start off near the top. But after some months, I made my way into the B team. They had like 5 teams under 19 going from A to E. And so I managed to get to that team by the end of the year. It was a a fine way to get away from the family, I suppose, occasionally. But I was always conscious of the fact that after the game I used to have to run back to help in the shop. And so it wasn't exactly easy to go off and play rugby for the afternoon. Subsequently, of course, Sam helped a little bit, and Harold had very little to do with it because he was still very young. And of course, Morris and I, we encouraged the younger ones to play sport. It was interesting that when I was going back to Jewish government, my parents were not that keen that I should play sport because they were frightened I would get injured. And so they never would buy me the apparel to play with. So I had to either borrow or somehow find the equipment because the schools didn't supply you with boots or under or shorts. They did give you the jerseys, but being a goalkeeper, you had to find your own jersey. So I managed to play for all this time with clothing that was either borrowed or I managed to get it through some other means I can't always recall. Or I played with clothing that was not really the correct apparel. When I went to high school, I had a similar problem, but I was able to earn some money and be able to pay for my equipment. By the time I was at university, I think my father was a little bit more accepting of the game, but also I was able to work every holiday while I was at medical school. Every vacation, I worked somewhere in order to earn some money so I could have some cash in the pocket. Although most of the money I earned, I did give to my parents, who were constantly battling. It was a hand-in-mouth existence mostly. And so it was unfortunate, but that's the only way we could survive. Anyway, the years of medical school were very hard and very fun sometimes, lots of fun, but we had very much good times. The first 3 years, of course, were very difficult because they were really mostly working from lectures, laboratory, and lots of information that you had to acquire in order to pass the examinations, which were mostly, in those days, of course, all essays which you had to write, and then you had to do laboratory tests. And we had some fun, particularly in the pharmacology lab, where we had to inject various frogs and rats. And sometimes we weren't sure what we had injected into the frogs. It was, we were kind of trying our hardest to have fun as well as to try and learn. And we had some very strange lecturers sometimes who didn't appreciate our little activities. And going back to the courses, the way the medical school is structured there, in the second year you do physiology and anatomy, and every 6 students has a body which they work with for the whole year, and you dissect it from one part going all the way down through all the organs on a daily basis, and so you become very closely attached to that group of people. And I always remember some of them, and some of them very fondly. There was one girl whose name was Elizabeth Bloomberg, who was, everybody was after her, I remember. But remember, most of the girls and boys were much older than me. There was 2 or 3 of us who were young. And so the average age of the girls was probably about 18 months to 2 years older. So we were really, kids for them, and they were going out with much older boys. So we were at a kind of a disadvantage socially. Also at our table was was a guy called Gruslovsky, who later became a dentist and changed his name to Grush or Grass or something. He went to live in England. There was also, in those days, of course, we talked about colored girls. There was a colored lady called Doris Shuping in our group. And there was also a guy called Dave Myers, who was actually somebody who had been there the previous year and had to repeat the year, having not made the grades. In that system, you could not carry grades. You either passed or you failed. And if you had to fail, you had to repeat the whole course again, not just one part of it. David Myers, the last time I heard of him, he was an anesthetist in Denver, Colorado. So we were very friendly. And of course, then on either side of the tables, we became very friendly with the people. And on the one side was who became a very good friend of mine was Proman Nobel, and on the other side was Ashley Raymond, and so we made our friendship from way back then through the second year at medical school. And in the third year, I kind of became very friendly with Bernie Goodman, who was a young Jewish guy from Kensington, and then an interesting character called Ken Woba, who was from Slavonic background, who later became a big professor and head of medicine both in Texas and also in San Francisco, and is quite renowned now in endocrinology in the United States. Bernie Goodman is a psychiatrist in New York. Proman Nobel is a major cardiologist in South Africa, and Ashley Raymond is still practicing OB-GYN in private practice in Johannesburg. While this was going on, I continued to play rugby, and I played occasionally for the A team in the under-19 group, which was probably one of the best rugby teams they ever had at the University of the Witwatersrand. Subsequently, I played in the senior rugby for some time. I played some games for the first team. I was 1 year captain of the second rugby team, which dominated the league at that year and became probably one of the best teams they ever had in that division. Some of the players who we played with became renowned in South Africa, like Rosenberg, Kaminer, Elliott. They played for their country. Freddie Herbst, who played for the province. Lombard played for his province. And so there were a number of famous players that were at that time contemporaries. There was another Springbok called Mike Antelm, who joined the university from Natal University. Meantime, back at the ranch, my parents had to give up their shop. I don't remember the reasons for it, but they then moved to a store which was in a new suburb that was developing in Johannesburg. And so, because my father had never really learned to drive, he had attempted it once or twice unsuccessfully. They needed to be driven and collected every day from the store, which was in the north of Johannesburg. We still continued to live in High Street, Berea, where I stayed until I got married eventually. My parents had a kind of a country type store. They had everything you could imagine, from sewing material to papers, writing paper, and so on. And again, not very successful financially. So when I went to medical school, some of my duties was also to make sure that I did this driving on occasion. When I This was subsequent to my completion of medical school. I was already, I think, a resident at that stage, but there was so much involvement in my life that there seemed to be a constant going on between what my parents were doing and my life, because a lot of it depended on the goodwill of the kids to keep their businesses going, because there was very little margin for error. But somehow we always seemed to have enough to eat and to drink. We may not have been the best dressed, but we seemed to have clothing and so on. I graduated from medical school in 1958, and in the system in South Africa, you have to continue to complete a year of not residency, but internship, before you could go and practice or go on to specialize. So I remember actually, even in the year of my internship, where I may have been on the night before, that I would come back to the store and actually work for a couple of hours in the evening when it was busy, to help out between the hours of like maybe 6 and 8 or so on, and even some nights actually stay there. And the way we used to amuse ourselves in the shop, there were always some of our friends there. We became very friendly during my high school days with a guy from Canada called Dave Levitt, and he would frequently come to the shop. He stayed not very far away in Hillbrow, which was probably about a mile away, and he would come there quite frequently, and some of the local people, Archie Tong, who was a boy who lived next door, and of course there was always my brother Sam. Morris had got married in 1958, my older brother, so he really fairly early on had left the fold and was running his own life. And he, for a time, actually lived in Springs after he got married, because he married a girl from that area. The interesting thing was that at the back of the store, behind the serving counters, was a sort of free space, and we were actually able to play cricket behind the thing. Occasionally, of course, a bottle of squash or something would come tumbling down, but somehow we managed to keep the number of breakdowns and smashes to a limit, and it didn't seem to cause too much harm. But that's the way we amused ourselves in between the customers.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pause it. Hey, come on in.
Hello.
You just get a little closer. Okay.
After I completed my internship, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. But the funniest thing happened. I really was considering going into orthopedics when I met an old classmate of mine called John Fletcher, who I suppose should be rhymed with the word Letcher. He had many escapades, but anyhow, he kind of talked me into starting a senior housemanship at the Queen Vic, which was they called the maternity hospital, where actually I had been born in 1935. So the way he tried to taunt me into going in, he kept telling me how beautiful the nurses were there, and that there were lots of nurses always available. Anyway, so that somehow was how I got into the obstetrics and gynecology business. So I did my senior housemanship in gynae at Coronation, and then, which was another one of the hospitals in Johannesburg, which was attached to the university, and also the obstetrical part at the Queen Vic, and then I continued on to be a registrar. Of course, in this country it's called a resident. And I started my residency by working at Baragwanath Hospital, where I was there for the first 6 months of my registrarship. And it was a very tough 6 months. It was a very busy hospital. And actually, I was the only registrar they had at that time. Some of the senior doctors did help out. I can recall once working the whole night and the next morning being busy with operating and helping out and getting home 7 o'clock that night and actually falling asleep and not waking up for the next day. In fact, the doctors called me up to wonder what had happened to me because I never appeared for my clinic in the afternoon. So, but after the 6 months, I was then transferred to the Queen Victoria Hospital and the Johannesburg Hospital, where I completed my residency. At the end of 1963, when I completed my residency, I went to England to do the Royal College membership, which is the specialist examination, and I immediately took some locums while I was there because I had very little money at that stage. I had helped a good deal while I was in my residency in helping my parents to pay off their house so that the house they were staying in Berea was completely paid off. And when they eventually sold it, they got all the money because there was no mortgage left on the house. The time I spent in England was really nice. I spent a lot of time traveling. I was actually doing a number of locums in different parts of England. A locum, of course, is where you fill in for somebody else while they're on vacation. So I was able to get a lot of travel with very little cost because I could stay in the hospitals, although we got paid very little for the after they took off the tax and the medical costs for the national health and the cost of accommodation. You ended up with very little. But it didn't cost that much to travel from England, and so I managed to go on weekend trips up to places like Hamburg and Amsterdam and Paris, and of course different parts of England, going down to Dover and Plymouth and things of that nature. And so I saw a good deal of England, and actually I was fortunate to meet a young lady who was a dentist, and she was also interested in travel, and she had a car, and so we did manage to do a lot of traveling. And at that stage I was actually contemplating staying in England permanently. However, my brother Harold called or wrote to me and told me that financially the family were not in good shape and things were a little bit rocky there. The business was not going much anymore, and so they had to close the business that they had opened some years back in the northern part of Johannesburg. And so at the end of 1964, I returned to South Africa on the day that the first heart transplant actually had ever been done by the surgeon, Dr. Barnard. And so I then, in South Africa, in order to practice as a specialist OB-GYN, you have to actually do another year in training where you don't do obstetrics and gynecology. So I then did a year at the Germiston Hospital, which was close to Johannesburg, where we did all things that you can imagine. And funny enough, two of my old colleagues happened to be working at the hospital at that time. Dr. Raymond, Ashley Raymond, who I mentioned much earlier, who became a lifelong friend of mine, and also another doctor called Alex Chaitowitz, who were also doing their OB-GYN time at Germiston Hospital. And so it was quite a fun place for the three of us. Three gynecologists, we ran the hospital, and we played a lot of cards, and we had quite a lot of fun. And so after completing more than a year there, I then became one of the chiefs, if you like, as they used to call us, or senior medical officers, or junior specialists. And so I went to work at Baragwanath Hospital for a while, and then I was put in charge of the gynae department at the non-European Johannesburg Hospital. And at this stage of my life, that was now 1965. I started working after completing the Germiston hospital job. In 1966 is when I actually went to meet my present wife and lifelong friend now, Linda Greenwall, who I met at a party on a Yom Kippur night after the fasting was over. And we had gone out a few times. We had a few differences of opinion, shall I say. And then in 1966, I planned a trip, having collected all the vacation that I had, because I hadn't taken any vacation. So in 1967, I actually left on a round-the-world trip, which I then was able to do because I'd saved a bit of money, and I was able to get one of these special flights, around-the-world flights you could get in those days. You could make as many stops as you like. And I did the trip in 80 days. Essentially, I started off really going to a conference of the World Gynae Conference in Sydney, Australia, and another conference in San Francisco, which was really also helped from the tax point of view up to a point. And I made stops in Melbourne, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Japan, Honolulu, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Las Vegas, the Grand Canyon, Denver, Colorado, Salt Lake City, and then I went to visit all the relatives from the shtetl, who are of course related to my father and mother, who they had been in contact with for many, many years and had never actually met them. And so then I was able to go to Michael Kramer's bar mitzvah, who was the son of one of my mother's brother's children. So he was my second cousin, and meet there just about all the relatives of the Kramer family that were in this country. And I was also then able to travel up to Baltimore, Washington area to meet my father's family, who had also been writing to him, who he had never met. And then finally on to New York, where my old friend Bernie Goodman was, and I was able to stay with him for a while. And from there I flew from New York to Dublin. I won't go into all the details of all the places I went to on all these trips. Then from Dublin I went to Paris, and from Paris I went to Istanbul, and from Istanbul I went to Athens, and then from Athens to Tel Aviv, and then I eventually came back to Johannesburg. And then I continued working as the head of gynae at the non-European Johannesburg Hospital, and then I got married in 1969, and then I continued to work in the gynae department at this particular position in I think it was until about 1975. In 1975, I was asked to become the head of OB-GYN at Baragwanath Hospital, and then subsequent to that, they created a new chair of OB-GYN at the university for that particular position, and I then became the professor and the head of OB-GYN there in 1977. In the meantime, in 1968, I had also taken the South African college exam, the specialty exam, so that I could add that to my list of accomplishments. And in 1978, I became the treasurer of the Royal College in South Africa. And so in 1979, when the college had its 50th Jubilee, I we went over there to be presented to the Queen, which was quite an event. And the subsequent years are the transmission, the actual conversion from becoming a South African to an American. In 1980, we moved the family. By this time, of course, we had 3 children, Adam, Benjamin, and Rachel. Adam being born in 1970, and Rachel in 72, and Benjamin in 75. And we came to Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago because that's where I was able to get a position. There was a lot of uncertainty in South Africa in the late 70s, both politically, economically, and also because the future was so uncertain. And so I decided at the age of 45 that it was the last time we could make a move, in my opinion. And so when this job became available here, which I took at Michael Reese Hospital, we moved to the United States, and we came to live in Evanston, Illinois. The reason we had the contact was because Lindy's sister lived in Chicago, and so I was able to make a contact, not directly through her, but just because she happened to be here and I could speak to people here. And then subsequently in 1983, the Michael Reese Health Plan, which had started in the 70s, and began to expand rapidly, and they needed to have a gynecological department. So they asked me to become chairman of OB-GYN, which I then maintained this position right until 1997, when things began to change in the way that the insurance companies practiced. Humana had taken over Michael Reese Health Plan in about 1989, and then around about 1996, 97, they had started what they called outsourcing their care. In other words, they didn't hire their own physicians and doctors in the specialties, and so they would then go out and contract with various groups of doctors to take care of their patients, so that they wouldn't have to pay all the benefits, insurance, etc. And so then I finally left Humana and joined a group of doctors, which was run by Doctors Bazorgi and Farahati, and that's the particular group that I'm now doing my OB-GYN with. And I'm now just a regular OB-GYN doing his full duty as a specialist, and working my required number of hours and calls. And so for the first time in my life, I don't have all the headaches of having to make sure that the departments are running and that everything was as smooth as could be. One of the interesting things is during the time that I was at Baragwanath Hospital, I was able to change this whole department, and I don't want to take all the honors, but from a department that was barely able to get enough staff, by the time I left there in 1979, the OB-GYN staff at Baragwanath was 72, which had 24 residents. There were, yes, 24 residents, and there were 28, I think, interns, and a whole bunch of medical officers and specialists running the department. And it was now probably the major department in the Johannesburg group of hospitals, and we were part of a major program. So that had really developed. Unfortunately, times have changed, and it's not been able to be maintained at that level at this time. I'm now speaking to you just after Thanksgiving Day, and it's 1999, the 28th of November. Some of the memories I have, of course, the sad memories, of course, is my mother, who passed away in 1979 in January after having had a fractured hip, which didn't heal, and she was immobile, and she was kind of not very physically fit, and she was unable to maintain herself. And in some ways it was a relief when she passed away in January '79. My father passed away in 1987 in May. Sorry, yes, it was 1985. May 1985. And that was following a ruptured aortic aneurysm. My father had actually, and mother had come to America after my visit and had seen their relatives for the very first time. My father had not seen his one sister when he left Lithuania, when she was 6 years old at the time. My mother had not seen any of the relatives that were in this country at all, because her brother had passed away many years ago. But she did have a chance to visit all her nieces and nephews. So my original trip in '67 had led the way for their visit in '69. And they actually left for America shortly after Lindy and I got married. So that is a kind of a brief resume of my life in a nutshell. There are many events that I can recall in my life. One of them that I always remember was in 1938, when they had the 100th year anniversary of the Great Trek in South Africa. There was a big exhibition or reenactment, if you like, of the Great Trek with all the wagons, etc., which came to Ellis Park in Johannesburg. And we actually had scaled the fence. And I got my pants actually caught in the barbed wire, and I kind of half fell over. And right on the other side of the fence was a policeman who promptly shoved me back over the fence again. So those are kind of strange events that you always seem to remember in the background. I also, of course, remember my brother Sam's wedding in Cape Town, my brother Morris's wedding in Johannesburg. Of course, those were big events for the family, but they didn't have a great deal of impression on my mind because I don't recall a great deal about either event specifically. My brother Harold, who was the youngest one, he left for Canada sometime in the 70s, and so he did not really participate a great deal in the latter part of my life. My brother Sam had been living in Cape Town since right at the middle of the 1960s, and so we had only met on vacation times and odd occasions. So we had little change in that particular, wasn't too much recollection of all those events. Yeah, the other events that I always remember in South Africa is during the time that Lindy and I first got married, we stayed in an apartment building, which was one of those rent-controlled ones, and we lived on top of the servants' quarters. The actual those days the servants did live in the buildings. There was always a lot of scuffles at night between the policemen and the people living there. Half the time I never knew what exactly was going on. Sometimes it was due to drinking or illicit people staying on the premises. After we had lived there for about 2 years, we moved to a house in Westcliff, which is a beautiful part of Johannesburg, where the roads are a little bit hilly, and we always had, every Sunday morning for just about all those years, we had a tennis uh, program, if you like. And for most of those times, the Obels, Proman Obel and Nina Obel would come and play tennis, and also Harry Klompus, who would be the other person who would frequently come. Other people came on odd occasions, but we always went. There was always this group every Sunday morning, and then after we played tennis, then we'd have to get all the kids up and then go to Pretoria for lunch. So sometimes we made lunch a bit late on Sundays, but that was a ritual, the Sunday lunch in Pretoria, and after playing tennis in the sun for that time, and lunch was always good for an afternoon schloff, which was appreciated. And of course, in the summertime, the kids always swam at the pool in the Pretoria home of Lindy's parents, Jack and Sylvia Greenwald. So those were wonderful days in the sun when the kids were growing up. They all really enjoyed it. There was an old little bicycle that they loved riding, particularly Ben and at least Adam and Rachel. Adam would pedal and Rachel would sit on the back seat, and they just loved going up and down the pathway there. So I say that I will cut this off now, and perhaps at a later date somebody can ask me any more specific questions about my past and present. I'd be happy to answer them.